Stephen, I wanted to ask you, what was like for you revisiting your own past day after day? I presume that not only did the actors look like your family, Gabriel definitely looks like you in the film, but the environments, were they similar to what you remember from growing up?
Yeah, yeah. It was a Kafkaesque experience, especially casting the Fabelmans, because I was casting this based on people I knew pretty well, and that's what sort of made it difficult, because the first difficult thing was deciding to tell the story in the first place. That was probably the hardest challenge in the sense that, this is my private life, and I leave a little bit of myself, we all do, behind in everything we perform in or write or direct or produce. We leave a little of ourselves behind. And so all of my films I consider to be personal films, but I've never really made a movie that is about a lived experience as opposed to just a metaphor to something else. And so it almost took the pandemic of having 2 years of doing nothing for me to have a chance for Tony and I to get on Zoom and talk about the feasibility of actually telling this story of a coming-of-age story. And it was also really wicked weird to walk onto a set and actually walk into my house from 1958.
Your old bedroom?
My old bedroom, the kitchen, the living room, the menorah in the right place, the balalaika against the wall. I mean, it was really, Rick Harder, who was the production designer, went back, and we have all these family pictures and 8mm movies and videos of my life in those days. So Rick really, rebuilt the environment.
Tony, can you talk to me about writing the screenplay? You said you did it on Zoom during the pandemic. We've done a conversation. I've written an article for Vanity Fair from an interview with the both of you, and you talked about Tony, that over the years you had said that should be a movie every time he would tell you an anecdote from his childhood. What was it like getting to that point where you said, actually, yes, this will be a movie, and will you write it with me?
I mean, I think what happened, we sort of edged our way into it slowly over the years, and after West Side Story was done, not before it was released, but after it was done, we began to kind of get serious about. I interviewed you a lot and we made long lists of his very, very busy childhood. He's always been a very busy person. And we had way too much. I mean, enough for like 6 movies. And we always knew what the center was going to be and what the film would focus on primarily. We worked for one summer just sort of writing out a long prose narrative of it, and then the early fall, playing with outlines, and then one day Stephen said, well, tomorrow let's get on Zoom and start writing, and I freaked out.
It was today. Let's start writing today.
No.
It wasn't today, because I had this impression that, why don't we just put fade in? Why don't we start with fade in? Most movies start with fade in. And we just sort of, I don't think my impression was we didn't make an appointment to start writing the script. It just started to all come out.
It would have been smart of you to do that, because I usually take like 3 or 4 years before I start writing, just to kind of
warm up,
clear my throat and adjust the pencils on the desk and everything. And he was 3 days a week, 4 hours a day, pretty much on the clock. And then I think to both of our shocks, we finished the first draft in 2 months, and then started doing rewrites, and everything happened. I mean, it just sort of flowed out. It was a fascinating thing. I had never written anything with anybody, and I didn't know whether it would work.
One of the things that really was sort of astonishing to me is how it kind of brought my mom and dad back. I had just lost my father a year before, and I lost my mom 3 years before. And so when this happens to all of us, we're kind of orphaned. And it was a really interesting process of recapturing through memory and through actually the physical act of creating scenes based on those memories. And then being able to invite my sisters, Ann, Sue, and Nancy, to share these memories with us by giving them the first draft script to read. and getting corroboration about, did this really happen that way? Do you remember it exactly like this? And getting that kind of corroboration from my sisters. And it was obviously the most personal thing I've ever been close to in my life. And it was difficult because of that. It was very difficult also since the last scene of the movie that's in the movie that Paul's in, we didn't plan it this way, it just so happened, but the last scene that Paul did as Bert with Gabriel as Sammy, the scene in the apartment in Brentwood, was on the day of the 1-year anniversary of my father's passing. And none of us knew this until someone pointed it out to us that day.
So Michelle and Paul, when you're playing a person who's in, Mitzi and Bert are fictionalized versions of Leah and Arnold, but were there questions you had for Stephen about who they were or what they were like? What kind of conversations did you have with him as you were finding the characters?
Well, it started from the moment that we met over Zoom. It was an immediate kind of spilling over of stories and recollections and just sharing and sharing and sharing, and it was that way. It was that way. It continues to be that way. So questions arose, but there was already so much in front of us to absorb and to sit with, So it began from the moment that we spoke.
Yeah, I think Stephen's vulnerability, frankly, and openness, opened the door for all of us, I think including the crew, to bring that part of ourselves to work. And I should also say that the script that Stephen and Tony wrote was beautiful. I mean, Michelle and I had said to each other, how lucky are we, that this is the language, these are the words that we get to work with. So not only was Stephen there for us in every open-hearted step about his life, his family, we also had beautiful characters on the page to sort of bring together Stephen's memories, his life, who are Bert and Mitzi, and who are Michelle and Paul, and where do those things meet? Because I think that's the only way to really capture the essence of who Bert and Mitzi are, is not through any kind of trying to please a memory, or but where do we all meet this together, and what are we making together?
Gabriel, I was curious. I've heard that you had, after you went through a number of auditions to get the part, then you started interrogating Stephen. Is that right? That you just had a lot of questions for him. Tell me about the research you did to play a version of the person who's directing you.
Well, I get the script about a week after I had been cast, and I remember spending that week incredibly nervous that I would be unprepared. And so I'm just watching all of his movies and trying to get as much, old interviews and stuff. And then when I get the script is so dense and perfect, and every word has a very, very specific meaning, every letter, literally. And there's just so much input that regardless of it being a real person, I have to talk about it with someone. And the glory of it is that this character is based off of him. So every scene that would happen, did this really happen? It did. Okay, what did you feel? What did you think? How did your perspective change? What did you think of, how did relationships change? Who did you think of these people? And I tried to do that as much as possible, maybe 1 or 2 times a week. And sometimes he would tell me, and sometimes he wouldn't, and he'd want me to figure it out, because yes, it's based off of him, but at the same time, it's Sammy and not Stephen. We could hang out and talk about the movie, but then also just get to know each other. And that was the best part. Because we also couldn't meet each other in person. It was 2021, and I hadn't been vaccinated yet. You needed to be fully vaccinated before going on to set legally. And I in Canada for my age group, I was just eligible for my first vaccine, which back then the requirement was 3 weeks until you get your second dose. But in the States, it's 2 weeks. So I got to do a little loophole so I could be there on time and start filming. And so I didn't meet him until we were both on set together.
Judd, I wanted to start by asking you about a very famous role from earlier in your career. Alex on Taxi was the straight man. He was surrounded by all of these colorful characters, and in this movie, you get to be the colorful character, the big purple rose on the birthday cake, as Uncle Boris.
I surrounded everything myself. There was nobody else. You know what I mean?
Tell me about playing this wild card who comes in and stirs up this young man's life.
Yeah, it was a puzzle. Well, Stephen saw. I don't know how the hell he got to me, but what could you possibly have seen that I've done anything like that? Unless it was, because
Independence Day.
Okay.
Among everything else you've ever done.
I was responsible for saving the world, if you know what I'm saying. Yes. When Stephen called me and told me that the character was such, I had no idea what I was going to play because I didn't get the script yet. So I said, well, okay, where does he come from? And he said he was sort of guessing. He said he can come from Ukraine. All right.
And this was a real man in your life?
Yeah, Uncle Boris.
Was he really named Uncle Boris?
His real name was Uncle Boris. Yeah,
but
he didn't change that.
But if you heard our conversation, I'm not quite sure I believed him. Mm-hmm. I thought it was fictional. I really did. When I looked at it and I met Gabriel, I said, I'm going to destroy this boy. That my part is to tell him that horrible things are going to happen to him, even though it has to happen. So I walked out of there and I said, who the hell am I? Some oracle that came from someplace, right? It sounds like that. It sounds like, so the last thing I said to Stephen when we were leaving, I said, thanks for parachuting me into this movie. And because it felt that way, you know. An oracle comes and sits in the kid's room and takes him apart and tells him he has to be a director.
Well, that's what it's like being a kid, is these older people in your life can be kind of mythological in a way. And the film closes with one such encounter with John Ford and Sammy, which is a real experience you had.
Yeah.
I think we saw the story, so you don't have to retell the story, but can you talk to us about casting John Ford and David Lynch and how that all came about?
Well, you know, it was something that I wanted to, that's how we wanted to end the story, end the film. That was the end of that segment of Sammy's life. And I didn't know who I was going to cast for John Ford. I think Tony and I were discussing a number of possibilities. And then Tony's husband, Mark Harris, said, what about David Lynch? And so I owe it all to Mark Harris. Getting him to say yes was another matter.
Well, what's that story?
Well, it just took a while because David wasn't really interested in appearing in front of the camera as much as he has done great work behind the camera. And it took a lot of phone calls, a lot of cajoling, and took a good friend of his, Laura Dern, that did a mitzvah by calling him several times to say, you must do this. And then the only thing he asked for when he finally agreed to do it, he said, all I'm going to ask for is I want to have the costume 2 weeks before I shoot because I want to wear it every day.
And he wanted Cheetos in his dressing room. and when he left, Cheetos. And when he left, he asked if he could take. There was still a lot left in the bag, and he very politely said, "Can I take these home with me?"
So I think it's worth it.
Absolutely.
That scene, ever since I've seen the film a couple months ago, has changed the way I take photographs, so thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Let's hear it for Steven Spielberg.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Michelle Williams, Paul Dano, Gabriel LaBelle, and Judd Hirsch.